Welcome to Challenging Climate, a podcast where we discuss the science, technology, and politics of climate change. I'm Pete Irvin, a climate scientist, and Jesse Reynolds is on holiday. In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Steve Smith, Executive Director of CORE, or CO2RE, as I read it, the UK's greenhouse gas removal hub, which evaluates the potential of and policy options for the full range of carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, technologies. And in our conversation, we make a sweeping survey of all things CDR. What separates it from mitigation? How does it figure in current and future climate policy? What are the different options and how should we evaluate them? And crucially, will we ever see it deployed at a large enough scale to change the climate? For all that and more, listen on for my conversation with Steve Smith. But before I go, if you're enjoying this podcast, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. These reviews really help to attract new listeners. So if you think others would enjoy this show too, take a couple of minutes to let them know. All right, on with the episode. Welcome to Challenging Climate, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
So we like to start off by asking people about their background. How did you come to become the Executive Director of CORE, is it?
Well, I studied physics at undergrad, so I was a science geek and into the physical sciences. And I then went on to study for a PhD in atmospheric physics. It was clouds and the role of clouds actually sort of in the radiation balance of the atmosphere. And this started at 2005. So climate change was definitely part of the discussion. The IPCC's fourth assessment came out sort of when I was well into my PhD. And so I found the subject matter fascinating, but I guess I always quite enjoyed communicating and working out, well, what are the implications of scientific research? And I had the very good fortune that when I was finishing my PhD and wondering what on earth to do with my career, the UK Parliament was passing this bill, which became full legislation and act, which was the Climate Change Act we now have, which set a long-term target for where we wanted to get UK emissions to by 2050. And a system of carbon budgets to get there. I know you've had Chris Stark sort of give the lowdown on a previous podcast on how it all works. And this climate change committee that Chris Stark now is chief executive of to advise on what the targets should be and monitor progress and report on that. And it turns out they were just getting started. They decided they needed a climate scientist on the secretariat helping with the day-to-day work. So I joined the CCC as a scientist and I was there for about 9 years. And then I actually moved directly into government and helped lead the team of climate scientists that actually work within the UK government. There's about a dozen. So for a good decade or so, I was a scientist, but working mainly in policy and very much at sort of national policy levels, thinking, how does the UK actually contribute to fixing the climate problem? And then it was in 2020 that I left the civil service, rejoined academia, came to the University of Oxford, with the intention of doing research on continuing at the interface between science and policy and decision-making around net zero and around carbon removal specifically, which sort of emerged in recent years and have more salience in the discussion about how we deal with climate change. And we now, out of the University of Oxford, lead CORE, as you said, this research programme, which is funded by UKRI, so the research councils here in the UK, to be a national research hub and engagement as well on issues of carbon removal, how we scale them in the UK and globally. So it's actually a 7-university initiative, but I'm the executive director of it based here in Oxford.
Great. So what is carbon removal or greenhouse gas removal? It's got some various terms. What does that cover?
Yeah, so if we're talking carbon dioxide removal, it's essentially any method which captures carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it away durably, which can be in the land, in the geosphere somewhere underground, in oceans or in products. So that covers a variety of things. There's lots of different methods, right from, planting trees through to direct air capture machines, storage, and lots of things in between. But they all share, I guess, a few key features. One is that the CO2 that they're capturing comes from the atmosphere. Another is that you take it out durably. So it's not fossil source CCS where the CO2 is captured from coal, oil, or gas, or maybe limestone. And it's not where you're putting it into products where the CO2 might rapidly get back into the atmosphere. And also really crucially, it's a human intervention. It's an activity. Because, of course, the land and the oceans are giving us a massive leg up already in absorbing year to year roughly half of the fossil CO2 that we put into the atmosphere. So when we're talking about carbon dioxide removal, generally we're talking about something that's additional to the national processes going on.
So the term geoengineering or climate engineering often covers both carbon dioxide removal on the one side and solar geoengineering, which I work on the other side. Do you think that term is still useful?
I try not to use it myself, partly because, as you say, it covers such a broad spectrum of methods. I mean, even the term carbon dioxide removal or greenhouse gas removal, I quite often find in conversations with people, I might be talking about one form of carbon dioxide removal, and the other person, it emerges halfway through the conversation, has a completely different mental model of what we're talking about. So I'm wary of using kind of very broad bucket terms to describe things, because a lot of these different methods have very different features and involve, very different actors and different issues. So, and geoengineering, is this super category that covers carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management, which itself involves lots of different potential methods. I think is probably more unhelpful than helpful, I find, in kind of most conversations.
And I guess on the other side, is there a sharp distinction between mitigation and some forms of carbon dioxide removal?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I'm with the IPCC on this. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually defines mitigation to explicitly include carbon dioxide removal. So it says mitigation is, I think, a human intervention to reduce emissions or enhance sinks of greenhouse gases. So I would class carbon dioxide removal as a form of mitigation. And I think that given that the Paris Agreement, for instance, explicitly says that part of what we're going to do to achieve our global temperature goals is reach a balance between anthropogenic sources and sinks, it kind of makes sense to have some sort of bucket that includes both emissions reductions and CDR. But I appreciate, different people have different views on that one, but I'll go with the IPCC.
That's always a good bet. Great. So I think you were just touching on it there. Carbon dioxide removal is now sort of part of the visions that many nations have for the future, or the IPCC has for our future on climate. And I think key to that is another term I'd like you to define, which is net zero. What is net zero and why is it important?
Yeah, so net zero as a term came out of the scientific literature in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s. Specifically to mean this balance of anthropogenic sources and sinks. And it was principally about carbon dioxide. So in the history of climate research and trying to ascertain what is the dangerous level of climate change, a lot of people, for largely historical reasons, I think, and issues of kind of how models were designed, we're looking at what's a safe level of stable greenhouse gas concentrations and CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And they were struggling a bit because what was emerging was actually if you keep atmospheric concentrations fixed in perpetuity at a given level, it's very hard to work out what the upper limit of warming is. This is the so-called equilibrium climate sensitivity. And actually, one of the people I have the privilege of working with in Oxford Net Zero is Professor Miles Allen, and he was one of the first scientists to actually say, well, hang on a minute, maybe this is all a bit of a red herring, because is it really credible that, our descendants and their descendants are going to hold concentrations fixed because that was the international agreement in the early 2000s or 1990s with the UNFCCC and the Rio Earth Summit. And, Earth is gradually getting warmer and warmer, things are getting worse. And they say, well, we agreed this 100 years ago, so we're going to stick to it. And actually, he found there's a much better constraint on the total amount of CO2 that we emit from the start of the Industrial Revolution until such time as we switch off, and the peak warming that we get. So this gives rise to the idea of a global CO2 budget associated with any given temperature limit, like 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, or even 4 degrees, 5 degrees. And also the corollary that, of course, if there's a carbon budget, we have to stop spending that at some point. So we have to get our CO2 emissions down to zero, or at least balance sources and sinks, so we're at net zero. Now, the net zero concept has taken on a life of its own now when it comes to the level of countries and indeed individual companies and universities and things who are all setting net zero targets now. There's been this huge profusion of net zero targets, and in a sense, the net zero concept has been like one of the most riotously successful scientific concepts in the last few years. But I think there are lots of other nuances that come in. How do you define the system boundary of a country or a company? Like if you're talking about the whole planet, as climate science was, it's pretty easy to say you're talking about all anthropogenic emissions. But what scope of emissions for an individual company are you including? Is it just the ones they directly emit within their own fence line, or is it, their entire value chain? And also, what does the net mean? Because a lot of people have taken that to mean the buying of offset credits, which is different, of course, to actually the net being direct anthropogenic removals. So there's a lot of discussion going on, and also it's become a general net zero of all greenhouse gas emissions, not just CO2. And there you have to get into some interesting questions about how you compare the climate effect of different greenhouse gases. So actually, while it's a really clear and robust scientific concept, I think there are lots of interesting questions, and a lot of work we're doing here at Oxford and in core is trying to get a good definition of what net zero means operationally for all these people now setting climate targets around it.
There's another concept I want to bring in here, which I think is quite important, is I'm not sure if we're still using the term hard to abate or residual emissions. What are those, and how can CDR help?
Right. So in the concept of net zero, you can either achieve that through absolute zero. You cut all your emissions, you're at net zero, you've stabilized the climate if you do that for CO2, and you take reasonable account of the other greenhouse gases. But a lot of pathways that are built up using economics and an understanding of our economy and our industrial systems and our land systems, the kind of scenarios that are looked at by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tend to show that it's more optimal to do an awful lot of emissions reductions, but you tend not to get to a complete cessation, certainly on the timescale that's required for sort of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. And so you've got this rump of residual emissions, or hard to abate emissions, as you say. And then to get to net zero, you have a corresponding amount of removals to balance those out. I'm not aware of a really, really hard and fast, widely agreed definition of what those hard to abate emissions are. I mean, you tend to see that in these pathways, a lot of things are almost essentially decarbonized. They get down to zero emissions. So electricity generation is one of those. Once you do that, you can electrify a lot of road transport. You can electrify heating. You can do a lot of energy efficiency and materials efficiency, of course, so you just avoid emitting in the first place. So it tends to be sectors such as aviation, flying aircraft, some agricultural emissions, which are not to do with energy, but are to do with, the way we grow crops and livestock, some industrial process emissions. And those are often termed hard to abate. I think a couple of observations on that one, though. One is we have to be really careful not to assume that because a sector is hard to abate, that means it's a do-nothing sector. So even in a lot of these pathways, if you don't get to zero, there are a lot of measures you can put in to get lower than you would if you do nothing. Even with flying aircraft, if you put a carbon price on that to represent the true value of the environmental damage being done, you might reduce demand. You might have more efficient aircraft. You might have more efficient routing patterns. So it's not that you're doing nothing. The second observation is just sort of based on personal experience. I think we should be pretty humble about which sectors are going to be easy to decarbonize and which ones are going to be hard. You can do a kind of simple economic analysis and work out what's cheap and expensive. But if we just take the example of, trying to get homes better insulated here in the UK, like in narrow economic terms, it's a total no-brainer. It saves people money. You might pay a little bit up front, but it can pay itself off really quickly. But we have really struggled to actually do it. So there are a lot of complex kind of social and political barriers in addition to economic barriers. And conversely, it might be that things that look really hard become easy. I mean, when we did our first report as the Climate Change Committee recommending what the UK's 2050 target should be, one thing we got right was, I think we said the electricity sector needs to decarbonise fast because there are ways to do that and you can then electrify other sectors. But the way we looked at doing it was, I think, kind of said offshore wind is expensive, nuclear power is cheap, carbon capture and storage is just around the corner for the energy sector, and energy efficiency is easy and a no-brainer. And almost all of those things have turned out to be wrong. So I think when we work out what's hard and easy to abate on the timescale of sort of 20, 30 years, we need to be a little bit cautious.
Great. Yes, you just mentioned you were working in the UK government at the time it revised its climate goals in light of Paris and set itself net zero target. How did that come about? What's some of the internal workings of that?
Right. So I guess fundamentally, there's this architecture of the Climate Change Act I mentioned. There's this legislation in the UK which says the UK must have a legally binding target for where it gets its emissions to, or its net emissions, sources and sinks, by 2050. And that had already been set at least 80%. So we needed to have an at least 80% reduction by 2050 relative to 1990 levels in the UK. That was already in place since 2008. I think one of the big things that happened clearly was the signing of the Paris Agreement. Actually, in 2008, there was a lot of anticipation ahead of the Copenhagen Accord. And of course, that proved to be a bit of a disappointment. But then a few years down the line, we had the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement really came out in many ways more ambitious than a lot of people expected. People were hoping we get some form of globally comprehensive deal, but were very reticent about that given, the fingers burned at Copenhagen. We got a globally comprehensive deal, but it was a globally comprehensive deal which also said the target is not only 2 degrees, it's well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to 1.5 degrees. And also, in order to achieve that, we need to get globally in the second half of the century to a balance of anthropogenic sources and sinks. This was a big step up, and I think not everyone saw this coming. So globally, we'd seen this increase in ambition. And one of the factors the UK Climate Change Act says needs to be taken into account in setting UK carbon budgets and targets is the international policy context. So I think the Paris Agreement was a big step. The other big step that actually also came off the back of the Paris Agreement was the negotiators tasked the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to produce a special report on 1.5 degrees, because this exploded onto the political scene with the Paris Agreement. And everyone realized, actually, we don't know much about this target. We've all been, certainly in Europe, Northern Europe, we've all been focused on 2 degrees. We haven't really looked at how we achieve 1.5 degrees and what we gain in terms of avoided impacts if we look at the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees and higher levels of warming. That special report came out, was it in 2018, I think? And it had a pretty strong message around global net zero emissions. One of the big headlines was, globally, we should get to net zero CO2 emissions around about 2050 by mid-century if we want at least an evens chance of staying close to 1.5 degrees. And I think that really lodged in the minds of policymakers. So there's the Paris Agreement, there was the special report with that message. I think socially in the UK, we had the rise of Extinction Rebellion and a kind of fresh wave that we hadn't seen since 2007 or so of real social action to say this is important, we need to be doing more as a country and sort of pushing policymakers. And I'd moved from the CCC into government at the time. I actually kind of vividly remember a meeting where people working in climate from BEIS, the government department at the time, and other government departments were convened to say, right, off the back of the IPCC report, we need to start thinking about whether the UK will set a net zero target or in some way increase its long-term ambition. And while that meeting was going on, we had protests outside the front of BEIS. We had people gluing themselves to the windows, people running out in front of traffic. It was actually really hard to pay attention during the meeting because we were all kind of rubbernecking to see what was going on outside. So I think there was a kind of confluence of scientific analysis, global political agreement, and social action. And the government tasked the Climate Change Committee to actually do a report saying, should we be considering net zero emissions? And they came out and said, yes, we should, because of the international circumstances. And also we think that the cost of getting there, because of the way that technologies have moved on and emissions evolved, is broadly the same as what we thought it would cost to get to an 80% reduction. And so that got legislated in 2019. And it was a privilege to be a small cog in the wheel of making that happen.
Yeah, so one of the complaints I hear from some in the academic community and activist community is that all this talk of carbon dioxide removal, of net zero, is distracting us from near-term emissions cuts. Was that the case in the UK? Did we slack off on our near-term emissions targets because we had this new technology we could promise to deliver in the future?
No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, first up, the net zero target was a step up in ambition relative to the target that was before, which was this 80% target. And I think that's true in most cases where countries and organizations have set net zero targets. It's a step up in overall ambition. Certainly, if you look at the UK and other countries, even other countries that don't have as kind of coherent and holistic a structure as the climate change acts we've got in the UK, generally they haven't changed their targets for 2030. We've got these nationally determined commitments that all countries have to provide as part of the negotiations. None of those have been relaxed when people have set a net zero target. I guess the slightly more nuanced look would be, well, if you interrogate their plans for how they intend to get to 2050 or whenever they want to get to net zero, can we discern that those plans involve a reduction in ambition on emissions, so fewer emissions reductions and more carbon removal than they might have done with a previous target? Certainly, the UK the government has published its net zero strategy, and the level of removals in that is not such that, it means a less than 80% reduction in emissions. And even the 80% target, if you look closely, had some removals in it actually. So the idea of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, the idea of planting more trees, they were all in the first Labour government strategy for getting to the 80% target way back in sort of 2010.
Great. One of your projects is Net Zero Tracker, I believe, which tracks the development of the net zero policies around the world. How is it looking? How far has this idea spread through international governments?
Yeah, this is a really fun project. It's one that we do at Oxford in collaboration with a few other people. And it's almost like a citizen science or a student science project because we have a huge number of volunteers, mainly Oxford University students, who willingly donate their time very kindly to actually pore over all the countries in the world, major regions around the world, all the cities with a population over 500,000 and the 2,000 largest publicly listed companies. And they say, well, have they set a net zero pledge? And what can we say about the robustness of their pledges in terms of, so how soon are they aiming for net zero? Have they published a plan? Are they reporting their progress towards it? What do they say about carbon removal and about trading of offset credits to achieve it, and so on? And we kind of rode the crest of a wave of net zero pledges. We got this going sort of 2021 in the run up to COP26, the negotiations in Glasgow. And of course, the UK was holding the presidency for the negotiations. And one of the things it really went for was trying to elicit net zero pledges from countries, but also from a range of companies and so on. And so there was this massive explosion in net zero pledges from countries during that period, and also from major companies and from cities and so on. We're now at a really interesting point where net zero is totally mainstream. So if you look at how much of the world is covered by some kind of national level net zero commitment, and that might be something as firm as a law, or it might just be a slightly more wishy-washy pledge, or, a minister has stood up and said, it's our intention to get to net zero, but some form of net zero pledge. Over 90% of the economic output of the world, so 91% of GDP, I think 80% of the world's population, just over 80% of global emissions is covered by a net zero pledge. And if you look at major companies, we're now up to the point where well over 800, I think we're maybe nudging over 900 out of the 2,000 largest public companies have some sort of net zero pledge. So we've moved pretty rapidly in the last 2 to 3 years from sort of UK presidency and others urging this increase in ambition and saying you should set a net zero pledge to, well, actually, an awful lot of people have set a net zero pledge, and it's a question of delivery. Like, how robust is that commitment? How robust is the strategy to get there? How confident can we be that that's leading to more action than there was before?
How cynical are you about these pledges? It's quite easy for president or prime minister to promise that 40, 50 years hence, some wonderful goal will be achieved. And it's much harder for them to say, by the end of my tenure, I will have cut emissions by 10%. How many of these targets will be met?
Oh, you're pinning me down now. I'm not sure I could give you a number, but I'd certainly recognize the criticism. I think along with this wave of net zero pledges, there's also been a wave of questioning and in some quarters cynicism over whether it's A, going to lead to action, and B, whether it's actually a distraction tactic. Because as you say, you can set a lofty pledge. It's like the drunkard who says, I'll go sober, in 2 years' time. You kind of want to ask, well, what are you putting in place now to actually get you there? And is that soon enough? So I tend to think that in a lot of cases, these net zero pledges are coming from a good place, right? So they are a step up in ambition. And there is no strong, firm legal compulsion that actually requires many of these entities to come forward with net zero pledges. But I think there is a genuinely important and legitimate question about whether that is leading to action now. Because to come back to the scientific point about what actually limits climate change, it's cumulative emissions over the period until you switch off. And so if you're still emitting loads in the near term, and then you suddenly come to a screeching halt and reach your net zero target, you've actually dumped a lot more CO2 into the atmosphere than if you come down rapidly now and reduce that kind of area under the emissions curve until you get to zero. So near-term action is absolutely crucial. Of course, these pathways that the IPCC says are broadly consistent with 1.5 degrees that get you to globally net zero CO2 emissions by mid-century also crucially involve a rough halving of emissions or thereabouts this decade. Even this decade is quite far off in terms of business plans for many companies. So I think one of the real kind of frontiers in terms of giving guidance to countries and companies and making sure that this is leading to action is thinking, what is a what does a plan look like in terms of real specific measures? What are you going to phase down? What are you going to phase up over what timescale that's consistent with, these kind of global pathways?
So yeah, speaking of those global pathways, the IPCC has these set of scenarios that will limit warming to 1.5 Celsius or 2 Celsius or so. What is the scale of carbon dioxide removal in those scenarios? Can you give us a rough sense of what we're talking about?
So there's quite a lot of carbon dioxide removal in all these pathways. So we did this report recently called the State of Carbon Dioxide Removal. And one of the things we looked at was, okay, how much carbon dioxide removal is actually happening now? Because believe it or not, we didn't really find a good estimate of that at the moment. That's kind of an important starting point. But then how much is in these kind of global pathways that are consistent with 1.5, 2 degrees? And in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the most recent Working Group 3.6 assessment, there's something like 541 global pathways, I think, that limit warming to 2 degrees or below. All of those have some form of ramping up of carbon dioxide removal in them. That's if you're including, tree planting, direct human activities to plant more trees, as well as these more kind of technological methods. So we calculated that actually there's something like 2 billion tons of carbon removal going on now, which is maybe a bigger number than many people expected. It's a lot smaller than the 40 billion tons net that we're putting in every year at the moment. But nearly all of that is through activities going on around the world to plant more trees, to manage forests better. And it's really important even then to say, of course, what we're doing on the land is still a net source globally because we're chopping down an awful lot of trees in other parts of the world. But we're planting them in some places and managing forests. And that's giving us about 2 billion tons currently. And a very tiny sliver of that 2 billion tons total is then the more tech stuff, the kind of direct air capture and the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and biochar and things. In the pathways to get us to our climate targets, there's a scale up to 2030 of maybe 1 to 5-ish, 5.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide removal. So that's this decade out to 2030. And then to 2050, it varies from sort of 0 to maybe 13 billion tons of carbon dioxide removal. So a pretty significant amount. I mean, if you look at the medians across those pathways, and of course, you have to be pretty careful just taking averages from pathways and talking about them as a group, because they come from a lot of very different models with a lot of different constraints and assumptions in. But if you just take the median, and if you look at the kind of technological CDR, like the direct air capture, the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, you're probably scaling up by a factor of about 1,300 times relative to what we've got now by 2050 to stay aligned to these pathways.
I guess what everyone would like to be true is that afforestation, recovering wetlands, all of these nature-based solutions would be able to do the job. Can they be scaled up to get to that 13 gigatons a year? Do we need to rely on these more technological means?
Yeah, so probably not to the 13 gigatons. I mean, there's an awful lot that I think we can do. I mean, the obvious priority is stop chopping down trees and degrading wetlands, right? But then there are places where they have been degraded and there is scope to improve them and actually get them soaking CO2 up again. There are some really interesting near-term trade-offs in that sometimes when you get these ecosystems going again, they actually emit a bit of methane and sometimes nitrous oxide, which are other greenhouse gases. But in the long run, I think there is a lot of scope to restore these ecosystems. And of course, if that's done well, that's good for a whole host of reasons beyond just climate. I mean, they're more resilient to future climate, but they also increase our biodiversity, give us many other benefits in terms of water quality, air quality, and so on. I think it's important to say that there is a subset of pathways, even considered by the IPCC, which have little to no technological carbon removal. They achieve the climate targets by going really, really hard on emissions reductions and doing some of this land-based removal. But I think the interesting question really is kind of how feasible are all these pathways, both the ones with high amounts of technological CDR and the ones with hardly any technical CDR. And there's the kind of headline that all these pathways involve some kind of level of CDR. But I think going back to this point about hard to abate emissions and how successful will we be on emissions reductions and where will we end up when we do eventually get to net zero, which points to this kind of deeper point in my view, which is we're going to need to push a portfolio of options and learn by doing. And some of those options are strategically valuable. So I think it makes a lot of sense to be doing both the kind of land-based nature restoration and the technological stuff, because we don't exactly know what works. We're trying to be hugely ambitious in stabilizing the climate at 1.5 or 2 degrees. So we're kind of in the business of having lots of options on the table rather than taking them off the table, I think.
So, I mean, with mitigation and with managing ecosystems, there are direct benefits. Solar power offsets fossil fuels, but it provides us with power. It's providing a useful service and saving us carbon. Carbon dioxide removal is, in these various ways, you're spending quite a lot of money to suck CO2 out of the air. I mean, here's a very rough calculation, but if we're talking 10 billion tons of CO2 being captured at $100 a ton, that's a $1 trillion industry. Who is paying for all of this and who is profiting?
Great question. And I think a really important question that's kind of at the forefront of the research in this field at the moment. I mean, first up, I'd say there are lots of different ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Some of them are expensive and really have the sole benefit of taking the CO2 from the atmosphere. So many forms of direct air capture and storage, they're expensive, they're early stage, they capture CO2, they don't do a huge amount else. There are other methods, there's tree planting, but there's also, for instance, use of biochar, where actually they're pretty well understood technologies. There are some things we can learn and innovate in, but these things have been done for a long time. And they often have other reasons why you would do them, improving soil structure, biodiversity, growing trees as a source of material to displace cement and build more houses with wood, for instance. So I think it's not universally true that we'd only do stuff purely for the purposes of carbon removal. But certainly when you're thinking about the point we hopefully get to in the not too distant future, where we've reduced a lot of our emissions, we are ramping up carbon removal, you're getting to the point where you might have done a lot of the things that have co-benefits first, and you need to move up the curve to the sort of direct air capture technologies where you're spending money and you're doing it very deliberately to remove carbon. And B, you're probably losing sources of revenue, because if you're, say, charging the polluters, the people emitting, you can recycle that money into removals, but you're going to run out of money when emissions really come down. So I think the who pays question is very live. In the near term, there are lots of people emitting, so lots of people can pay in principle. Really important to remember, of course, that it makes a whole lot of sense to do the cheap stuff first, and a lot of the cheap stuff is just don't emit in the first place. So there's a huge amount of scope to just focus on reducing emissions, and you might stimulate some of these early stage methods, but if you get too focused on them, it's a great way of losing money very quickly right now. But then in the longer term, who pays? I mean, one observation I would make is, in society, we already pay for tidying up of waste problems. And we even do that when it's expensive and there's no other obvious benefit other than just improving our environment and tidying up the waste, full stop. And even when it's economic to not make waste in the first place. So, we employ street sweepers, litter pickers to go out and tidy up the streets for us. We've decided as a society that we're going to pay, local governments, our local authorities, so that they can organize a system of street cleaning. It would make a whole lot of sense for people to just not drop litter in the first place. But sadly, it happens. And actually, so you mentioned, I think, $1 trillion, didn't you, for sort of 10 billion tons. The rule of thumb I've used was maybe a little bit more moderate. Let's say that we need 5 billion tons of CO2 removal. And let's say that on average, when it's at scale, it's going to cost $100 per ton of CO2, which might be a bit optimistic or might be a bit pessimistic. But if you've got a range of methods, it's kind of not unreasonable. That gives you half 1 trillion, but a 500 billion carbon cleanup market. Actually, the current global waste industry is about $500 billion. So we're talking about creating a carbon waste removal system that is similar scale to the current waste removal system we already pay for globally.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I've wondered is how much the assumptions of long-term, large-scale carbon dioxide removal are a little bit of an artifice. We've had this 2100 arbitrary line in the sand as the point where we're meeting our temperature targets or not. And with the shift to CDR, we're not worried about peak, but we talk a little bit about peak temperatures, but it's all these scenarios that get us below 1.5 Celsius. They overshoot 1.5 Celsius, and then just in the nick of time, by 2100, with rapid CDR, they get just below it. But of course, at 2100, the climate's going to keep going. And I guess I wonder, if we put ourselves into 2080, CO2 emissions have peaked. We're starting after a decade or so to get used to this changed climate. What are the incentives? I mean, obviously the Paris climate goal is long in the past. Will the policymakers of 2080 be setting their climate goal at? And will large-scale CDR serve that goal or not?
Yeah, I'm with you on this. A lot of the pathways, particularly that looked at 1.5 degrees a few years back, they were actually being constrained by achieving an evens chance of 1.5 degrees in 2100. And that was leading them often to overshoot. That and some other sort of biases in the model, I think, are kind of very high discount rates, which mean they kind of discount the future very rapidly. They were leading to sort of lots of emissions reductions in the near term, but not as much as might be sensible. And then an overshoot in temperature, and then a massive amount of carbon dioxide removal to 2100, and then the scenario stops in 2100. And I think this has been pointed out in more recent literature that it is a bit of an artifice, and actually maybe the more reasonable thing to do is constrain peak temperature. I mean, if you look at the Paris Agreement, it doesn't say we have signed up globally to overshoot and then come back down. It says we are going to stay well below 2 degrees and we're going to pursue efforts to 1.5. So personally, I don't think there's a strong basis for saying an overshoot and a constraint in temperature constraint in 2100 is the right interpretation. I think is you need to stay below those temperature limits. If you actually rejig the constraints in these model pathways to match that, what people have found is that you generally see more emissions reductions in the near term, even more, and you see lower amounts of carbon dioxide removal, especially in the second half of the century, because you're not trying to pull down, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 degrees of warming in 50 years, which is a hell of a stretch, to be honest. So again, I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty. If we're talking about what's the world going to look like in 2050, 2080, 2100, things have changed an awful lot in 20 years, let alone 30, 70 years. So we know that we need a huge amount of emissions reduction, especially this decade. We know that we're probably going to need much more carbon removal than we have now in order to balance out residual emissions, whatever they are, at the point where we want to get to net zero. And we might want the option to actually claw some back in the further future. We probably can't be really, really prescriptive on precise numbers, but those are probably good heuristics. And then the question is, well, what's the portfolio of options we push now? And I think that leads you to say there's an awful lot of emissions reduction we can do, but there's also a certain amount of carbon removal we should pursue. And actually, one of the things we haven't really talked about is the kind of interlinkages between emissions reductions and carbon removal, because it's quite easy to think of these as two monolithic things. And of course, even with emissions reductions, you've got a huge amount of different things: energy efficiency, nuclear power, renewables, electric vehicles, public transport, as well as in carbon removal, you've got planting trees, biochar, enhanced weathering, stacks. And actually, there are a lot of system-wide features that overlap and impinge on both of those. So I think the interesting question is, what are the strategic levers you pull now that can deliver both emissions reductions and maybe carbon removal as well?
Well, speaking of portfolios, that's sort of where I wanted to go to next, was if we were to build a CDR portfolio, we don't just have one option with CDR, we've got this whole range of possibilities. Before we get into those possibilities, what are the key characteristics? What are the key dimensions that you would look at for CDR technologies to judge them?
I think there are different things that are important for different decision makers. So, if you are working in the environmental department of a government, you're really interested in, probably you have the remit for climate, so you care about carbon dioxide balance and greenhouse gas balance of these different methods. You probably also care about impacts on water quality, on air quality, on biodiversity. If you're an energy ministry, you probably care about what's going to be the energy demand of these things, or whether they provide energy into the system, which some of them do. If you're an investor, let's say you work for an investment house that's thinking this is a possible industry of the future, I want to put some money in, you're probably interested in the market rate of return, or what's the policy coming down the line that's going to make this viable. But I think there are probably broad categories of things that matter. And this is actually one of the things we're doing in the core project, is looking broadly, what are the kind of principles or dimensions that you would look at when assessing carbon removals? And they boil down to things like, yes, what is the overall greenhouse gas balance of doing this intervention? What is the fit to the policy regulatory regime? So where are there things that you are not allowed to do? So an interesting example is, there's a real debate going on in stimulating biochar, because a lot of people use waste biomass streams to make biochar, and there are regulations about what wastes, in inverted commas, you can put on the land. So there are regulations which impinge on the extent to which you can do some of these things. There might be regulations that incentivize them. If carbon removal goes into an emissions trading scheme, or we've got the Woodland Carbon Code in the UK, which incentivizes people to plant trees. There's the broader set of environmental impacts. So what does this mean for nature, biodiversity, and so on? There's also the business model. So how, if people are doing these things, what's the incentive? Where do they get their rate of return? And there are a few other things like that. I think that there are some important meta questions as well about how easy is it to measure where the carbon is going. So in the lingo, monitoring, reporting, and verification, MRV, has become this big topic in carbon removal. There are methods in place already for things like planting trees and growing trees. They're not perfect, but they're in place and they're widely agreed. There are some things like direct air carbon capture and storage where there isn't really a widely agreed universal method for measuring them, but it shouldn't be too difficult to come up with one. And then there are some really interesting carbon removal methods like enhanced weathering, where you brush up rocks on soils, and working out what happens to the carbon there is a real kind of frontier science topic. And of course, if you're going to spend money, time, and effort on doing these things, you really want to make sure that you're getting the carbon benefit that you hope you're getting from doing them. So MRV is a really important kind of consideration in a lot of these methods.
That was a great job. You hit most of the points that I had on my list. I just want to add a couple more. Longevity of storage.
Yeah, that's a crucial one as well. People talk about longevity of storage or risk of reversal or durability. But the main point in that, I mean, if we go right back to the definition of carbon removal, it's about capturing CO2 and then storing it durably. That's the kind of IPCC word in land, oceans, geological stores or products. And so what counts as durable, how you might value different lengths of durability is a really interesting question. If you are putting carbon into trees, we've sadly seen actually that, real life offset projects where people have spent money to do that and accrued a carbon benefit. In California, there are projects that have recently gone up in flames due to wildfires. And those risks, of course, might change and even increase in the future climate. If you put CO2 in a geological store, I mean, you can always do these things badly. So you need to monitor and kind of minimize the risk of re-release. But generally, it looks like that's a pretty durable, effectively permanent carbon store. So there's a kind of spectrum of durability, different ways of defining durability. Interestingly for me, I think there's a corollary here with how we value different greenhouse gases and their impacts on climate. So we know that if you put a ton of fossil CO2 into the atmosphere from burning coal, oil, or gas, let's say, the effect on global temperature is that it raises global temperature within, a decade or two, and global temperature stays raised effectively forever, as long as we humanly care for. So that's not true of some other greenhouse gases. Methane is incredibly potent, but it has a half-life in the atmosphere of, a decade or so. And so that's a little bit like in impermanent carbon storage, in that you get a climate impact, but then if it leaks out over a decade or so, the climate is actually going to respond to that and sort of recover back to an equilibrium fairly quickly, unlike an effectively permanent emission of fossil CO2 or a permanent carbon store. So I think there are some things we can learn about how to do that well and how not to do that well, comparing levels of durability from actually how we compare different greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I think the afforestation or reforestation one is a really good example, because there has been a lot of problems in the past with that. And, in theory, if all goes well, it will stay there indefinitely. But based on the historical record, you might say on average, they only last, 20, 30 years before someone burns them down or uses it for something else. Some of the ideas have got two other limiting factors that I think are really important, which is energy. Energy uses, for some of them, require a lot of energy, and others require a lot of land. And that's been quite a controversial point. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so on the land point, obviously, if you are planting trees, or if you want to grow a lot of biomass for different applications where you're going to sequester that biomass, which could be bioenergy with CCS, it could be biochar, it could be some other way of converting into maybe a useful product and then sequestering the CO2, you need land to grow those things. Now, there are some ways of doing that where you're not actually putting the land in competition with other uses. So, it might be that you can reapply the biochar to land you've grown it on, or land where you're planting trees, and you can get a yield benefit if you do it well. So they're not in competition. But of course, we've got a finite amount of land on this planet. We've already put a huge amount of pressure on land through our just kind of growth as a civilization. We don't really want to put more pressure on it. And so there's a risk, of course, that if we rely on really stupendous amounts of carbon dioxide removal, we are going to exceed what our planet's land capacity can sustainably deliver. We're going to get into competitions with provision of food, with biodiversity, and so on. So I think it makes sense for a lot of reasons to prioritize using wastes and residues where we use the land already sustainably. I mean, one interesting example is if you have forests that you're already managing, so not converting a kind of virgin natural forest to management, but if there are places in the world, Scandinavia, the southern US, for instance, where we've been growing trees for many decades, and they're mainly grown actually for timber. The most valuable product is you get a saw log and you can make houses out of that and other useful things. But there's a good chunk of the tree which can't be used for high value timber. You get a lot of wood chip, low quality roundwood. You take the tree trunk to the sawmill and you get a whole lot of sawdust. A lot of the time that's just burnt or it's just left to oxidize. It makes sense to kind of use that for energy maybe at the sawmill. So you've got a bit more of a circular economy going on. And if it's going to oxidize to the atmosphere, let's get some useful energy out of it. But then B, if you can actually capture that CO2 and sequester it somehow, you've then got a carbon removal system, but it's one that ideally is only driven by the existence of waste and residues that are otherwise going to get oxidized into the atmosphere. So I think prioritizing those kind of feedstocks that are genuinely sustainable, and it's a really knotty issue actually getting that right, but I think, there are sustainable biomass supplies that exist. That helps relieve the tension. And this is a genuine issue because actually, I know some researchers published last year a land gap report where they actually said if you tot up the amount of land that's going to be involved for carbon removal in the kind of pledges that governments are putting forward in their nationally determined commitments and their 2050 plans, maybe we're already exceeding the level of the kind of sustainable capacity of land that exists.
I guess another dimension that I'm thinking about, I'm not sure if you agree on this, but I guess I sort of was thinking about CDR technologies and put them into sort of two buckets. One was things which have a local impact that's similar to other land uses or industrial uses, and then some, maybe not that many, that have more of a geophysical impact. They're changing biogeochemistry, they're changing ecosystems in novel ways. Is that a useful distinction?
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way before. So what would you put in what category then?
So I think basically almost all of them go into that local category, except for, in my mind, I had ocean iron fertilization, ocean alkalinity, and the rock weathering ones as sort of geophysical, because they're having these consequences sort of chemically that you want to track over longer distances.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. But with enhanced weathering, people look at different ways of doing that. But even if it's putting it on the soil, which is quite often the way, then the issue is, of course, that the CO2 becomes carbonate or bicarbonate, which runs into rivers and then ends up in the ocean. So actually, it's interesting maybe that all the examples you gave are ones where the long-term carbon sequestration happens in the open ocean, which is a very uncontained system, of course. And this comes back to the point I made about monitoring, reporting, and verification, where, how can you be sure then where the CO2 or the carbon ultimately ends up? It also, I think, touches on something we see as a fairly consistent theme in public sentiment, which is they don't like methods where you're intervening and you end up doing something which is relatively uncontrolled. The implications of your actions end up dispersed throughout the whole ocean, for instance. There's a kind of worry about limitations to knowledge and creating an impact that you can't really control. So yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit more, but I tend to think of carbon removal methods in different ways. But quite often it's what's the process you're using to capture the CO2? And then where are you putting the CO2? And they have lots of different interesting implications in terms of the potential risks, the co-benefits, the costs, the level of development, which flow quite naturally, I think, from the capture method you're using and the storage method.
Yeah, so in the State of CDR report that came out quite recently, you had the category of conventional CDRs. This is the managing forests, replanting forests. And I'm not sure if you call it this, we could have conventional plus, which might be, you bring in the wetlands, you bring in the mangroves, you're managing ecosystems to capture carbon better. Can these approaches go much beyond just undoing what we already did to the Earth's ecosystem in terms of its carbon cycle?
That's a nice way of putting it. There's certainly the case that if you think about the land and you think about the time, pre-human civilization or when our footprint on the land was way smaller than it is now, generally the world was way more forested. Wetlands, which store a huge amount of carbon, peatlands, were way less degraded. We weren't draining them for agriculture and so on. And so there's the way of looking at afforestation, reforestation, and restoring wetlands and restoring soil carbon, which is actually you're kind of refilling the bathtub of carbon in those stores back to where they were in sort of pre-civilization times. I guess the interesting question is, to what extent can you get that far, given, we've got 9 billion people on the planet? Or could you go further and even enhance relative to a sort of pre-civilizational baseline? I haven't really looked at the numbers to kind of compare the potentials that are there in the literature to the carbon contents of the biosphere thousands of years ago. That would be a kind of interesting exercise, and maybe someone's done it. But it's a nice way of looking at things, that in the land sector, what we're trying to do is actually refill a carbon store that's kind of depleted from some kind of healthy optimal state. Whereas with fossil CO2, what we're doing is we're digging out this massive reservoir of fossil carbon, which basically was totally inert, not in the carbon cycle at all. And we're injecting it as, in a way, new carbon to the atmosphere. It's actually very old carbon that was there, tens of millions of years ago. But it's kind of qualitatively different to conventional land restoration.
Yeah, what's your view of enhanced weathering and ocean alkalinity? One of these ideas that seems to have a very, very large potential in theory, but what are the challenges with this idea?
So yeah, the idea of enhanced weathering and kind of enhanced alkalinity is related in a lot of ways. There are a lot of minerals that are available in Earth's crust, the Earth's surface, or can be mined, which alkaline, and so they naturally soak up CO2 from the atmosphere, and you can enhance that natural process. It happens naturally to a very small extent. I mean, so small that it functionally makes no difference to soaking up the CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere. But maybe you can speed that up through processing the rock, through digging it, through spreading it on the ground, putting it in the oceans. And that way you sequester carbon. I think they're really interesting ideas. In fact, in the core project that I'm involved in, we work very closely with 5 demonstration projects, all looking at different ways of doing carbon removal. And one of them is an enhanced weathering project led out of the University of Sheffield. They certainly show that, from the modeling and from some small scale field trials, you can soak up CO2. The really interesting question, I think, or one of the really interesting questions, is the monitoring and reporting and verification question. So, okay, you can show that the minerals you apply are soaking up CO2. To what extent is that stored as actual solid mineralized carbon, maybe in granules in the soil, versus bicarbonate, which is dissolved in water and then runs off into river courses and into the oceans? So I think there's definite potential and there's scope to carry on researching them as maybe important methods. I think the real challenge to getting them operational and building confidence in them, either for people who want to kind of fund them through voluntary schemes or governments who want to actually incentivize them or obligate them, is can we become more confident about how we measure what's ultimately happening here to the carbon? So they're part of the portfolio, and there are projects out there that are actually doing this stuff. But I think there's some really interesting research questions which probably need to be bottomed out with a greater level of confidence before they become real mass rolled out solutions.
Another outlier, it seems to me, in CDR is direct air capture. It seems that most of the other ideas, or all of the other ideas, are sort of area limited. You need large areas to implement them. You need to grow the bioenergy so that you can put it into the bioenergy carbon capture and storage facilities. In the case of direct air capture, that's not it. The limit is more energy and capital costs. But I've seen in the State of CDR report, for all of the techniques, there was an upper limit on the potential rate of removal. What would set the upper limit on the rate of removal on direct air capture? Does it have one?
Does it have one? So the upper limits we cite in the State of CDR, I'm very happy saying, were taken pretty directly just from the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change report, so the Working Group 3 assessment. So we didn't do any particularly new work there. And that number is based on the studies that the IPCC looked at. But yeah, there are different ways of defining an upper limit to potential for various things. I guess there's a kind of, if you take the uppermost conceptual, where the physicist would start, like my old self, it's the kind of what's the geophysical energetic potential. And you end up with pretty big numbers for a lot of these methods. But then you kind of constrain it by land. You can constrain it by what you think is credibly the available amount of energy through build rates of our energy systems over the coming decades. You can then constrain it further through sort of social, political preferences and stuff like that. I mean, yes, it might be possible to build 6,000 DAC plants all around the UK, but there'll probably be a few people complaining on grounds of planning. So I'm not really sure about what the upper limit is. I think there is a value in estimating potentials, but I wouldn't also personally want to spend my whole career investigating potentials, because I think they rest on a lot of uncertainties, especially when you get down to the kind of social and technical points of view, and they will become very malleable because of how public preferences change. also the rate of innovation, which is really uncertain for some technologies, particularly DAC. I think there's a lot of value in learning by doing. So getting a small number of demonstration projects up and running and allowing us to learn the lessons from those, then iterating. If we find that there's some really horrendous side effects that we weren't banking on, we can take stock and stop there. But if we find actually that we've built a DAC plant and we realize there's a whole bunch of design engineering things we could do, which means we'd halve the cost if we built it again, then we have the opportunity to learn and fund that. So I think potentials are quite good for putting into these super long run systems models and having very big conceptual debates about, which ones might win out. I think practically in terms of achieving net zero and our climate goals, we probably need to get smarter at this kind of portfolio approach, but also learning by doing and having lots of opportunities to take stock and learn from the previous generation of things and then move on, because we might find out that the potential for direct air capture and storage is a lot bigger than we thought. If the energy penalty for doing it turns out to be lower because we discover a set of processes that's way more energy efficient, if we find that we're building huge amounts of renewable capacity just because wind and solar is so cheap, and then we're having to spill lots of that energy because we just don't need it, but we're happy to build it because it's so cheap, maybe we'll be swimming in cheap energy that we can use for direct air capture if we're not using it for mining Bitcoin or something else like that. So I think we can kind of learn this stuff as we go along to some extent.
Okay, well, I'd like to sort of bring it together now, focusing back in on the UK. Let's imagine it's 2050. We've got some amount of carbon dioxide removal. How big could that be, and how much could we get done within the territory of the UK? What would you put in that portfolio?
Wow, that is a tough question. I mean, there are estimates out there. If you look at Climate Change Committee's net zero scenario, you're looking at tens of millions of tons of carbon removal by 2050. I can't remember the exact numbers. The government's own net zero strategy has a number which is not far off, probably a bit higher, so higher residual emissions and a bit more, but you're looking in the kind of 50 to 100 million tons broadly. Compared to current net emissions of, I can't remember the exact number, but we're in the kind of 400s, I think, 400 million tons. So it's a fraction. It's not necessarily a small fraction, but still there's a lot of scope for emissions reductions. I think those are probably reasonable, but I guess a few things about those scenarios. One is they don't necessarily include the full portfolio of removals. What they tend to include is a lot of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, actually. A lot of tree planting, no biochar, no enhanced weathering, a very small amount of direct air capture and storage. But that's an interesting one because as you raised earlier, I think the constraints on that are really poor. So there's a certain amount of kind of finger to the wind calculation or just a kind of nugatory, we think this is a possibility, so let's put it in, but we don't want to get carried away, so let's put it in a not too big a number. So I think those are kind of reasonable sizes to aim for. But my sense is that there's a huge amount of scope for innovation in carbon dioxide removal methods. And we see a lot in the scientific literature that there are these very standard, very canonical carbon removal approaches. You have tree planting, you have biochar, you have BECCS, you have DACs, you have enhanced weathering. And a lot of the companies that are springing up and a lot of the kind of small scale innovation projects that are getting going often don't neatly fit in those categories. They're really interesting concatenations of biochar plus hydrogen generation plus BECCS. Or they are taking biomass and injecting it underground as like a bio-oil rather than doing biochar or something like that. So my sense is hopefully we can scale up carbon removal, but the carbon removal methods we'll be using by 2050 might not actually look exactly like the things that we are having in mind at the moment.
Great. Well, we like to end on an optimistic note, but I feel you've been quite optimistic throughout. So I want to end on perhaps on a question. Do you think the UK will meet its 2050 net zero target? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about that possibility?
It's funny, people keep telling me that I'm an optimist, so I guess it must be true. I mean, I tend to not think of myself as an optimist or a pessimist. I'm just, I'm cold inside. And I just feel like it's the right thing to do to be trying to fix this problem and trying to inject evidence, kind of possibilities into the discussion and make sure that they get delivered. So I'd like to say I'm neither an optimist or a pessimist. And I'd like to think that while I'm aware of the huge challenge, so, I mean, I like talking about carbon dioxide removal because I find it interesting and it's at the forefront of research. But we have to always come back to the fact that most of this problem is going to be solved by just not making the mess in the first place, and so cutting emissions. I think we are going to continue to cut emissions, certainly domestically in the UK, for a variety of factors. I'm not sure whether we're going to get to net zero. Not on course if we carry on at the rate we're doing, but we've also had some surprises on the upside so far. So the cost of renewables and battery storage have fallen way below what we thought it would. If we can replicate those in some other sectors, then we're in a good place to, if not get to net zero by 2050, then get to net zero sometime. Now, we're going to continue doing a lot of damage to the climate in the meantime, but I'm kind of optimistic that we're going to stop at some point. And it's a question of how stupid or clever we're going to be in sort of getting there quickly. So for me, it's not really about optimism or pessimism, but it's about having a go. Like all the best stories are ones where people actually go on a quest and it's against the odds and maybe they actually make it. Lord of the Rings is a great story because it's a bunch of hobbits who, take on enemies far bigger than them and manage to succeed. No one, to my knowledge, has written a great story. Maybe you can prove me if I'm wrong, where someone just gave up and that was the end of the story. So I think we need to keep working at it and see where we get.
Well, on that very balanced note, thank you very much, Steve, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thanks for listening. Please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/challengingclimate.